We've been on this series, The Heart of Christianity, for a month now. Golly, can you believe that? How much is there to say? No, I'm just kidding. And really looking past the ideas of being a good Christian, being a to-do list, right? Being a good enough and all that. We're really getting to the heart of it, which is the heart. The heart of Christianity is the heart. So the first week we looked at our attitude towards non-Christians, and how sometimes we can get a little bit prideful about it. The second week we looked at our attitude towards sin and the things that God hates. And then we looked at the third week, so this last week, we looked at our attitude towards ministry and how we can choose either serving people or we can choose to have an uncontrolled mouth. And, if all, and we looked at the idea that if all of our resources and time and effort as a church and as Christians is going to ourselves and to our own church instead of to the community, we're missing the mark. It's not good enough. Jesus called us to reach the lost, not just reach ourselves. And that's one of the things that we've been diligently working towards, helping to correct our finances so that way we can stop spending so much stuff on us and start spending more on Roswell and start spending more on reaching people. And really we're focusing on in the future. So we're going to continue this series and finish it off today with our attitude towards the culture, living by faith. How do we deal with the news, with politics, with the cultural norms around us? Do we conform to it? Do we rage against the machine? How do we deal with it? And this is an election year. It seems like it was just an election year last year, doesn't it? Doesn't that kind of seem like a thing? Maybe it's just in my head, but it seems like it's always an election year. There's never a time when it's not an election year. And during these times, it's very common for us to have ideas that kind of hop in our heads about, well, we'd be better off without some people, or we'd be better off without some group of people. And it's going to be real hard to reach the lost and minister to people if we've got that kind of an attitude. I know Jesus didn't ask people's political background before he reached them. He just reached them, and I think we do well to do the same. And this kind of self-righteous attitude is actually something that a prophet by the name of Habakkuk dealt with. Habakkuk served in a very troubled time in his nation, a very, very troubled time. And there was a huge division happening between those who were seeking God and the many, many, many who were not. They had some good leaders that were coming up in the nation, but their kids after them were not righteous. And so you had very sporadic righteous people in leadership and a lot of wickedness in leadership, and it just was not looking too good. And Habakkuk was very upset about the situation. And so there was a little bit of a spiritual tug of war in the nation, and Habakkuk wanted all the immoral people just gone. But he takes his complaint to God, and God's answer is not really what he was expecting. So we'll pick it up in Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 2. It says, "How long, Lord," this is the prophet speaking, "must I call for help and you do not listen, or cry out to you about violence and you do not save?" And he goes on, and it turns into a little bit of a dialogue between himself and God. And the basic summary of the book, it's just to kind of keep you on track here, he says, there's just so much wickedness in the culture. And God says, yep, and I'm going to bring worse. And then Habakkuk says, but hold on, how can you bring people more wicked to judge the wicked? How's that? They're better off than those people are. And so then God says, yep, this is what I'm doing. And you just get kind of a very tense thing that's going to happen. And then the prophet ends the book with a song. So in the midst of this dialogue that's happening, and God says, yes, but bigger sinners are coming. God describes a very big change that is coming to the culture. Habakkuk started off the book saying, the culture is so wicked, and God says, yes, and here are the changes for the worse that are going to happen. And we're not going to read the whole section. I encourage you to read it through this week. It's not a very big book, but a lot of stuff there. Verse 7 says, they are fierce and terrifying. Their views of justice and sovereignty stem from themselves. He's talking about the people who are going to come and make the culture even worse than it already is. In verse 11, then they sweep by like the wind and pass through. They are guilty. Their strength is their God. Then hop down to chapter 2, verse 5. It says, moreover, wine betrays. An arrogant man is never at rest. He enlarges his appetite like Sheol, and like death he is never satisfied. He gathers all the nations to himself. He collects all the peoples for himself. And then back up to verse 4, it says, look, his ego is inflated. He is without integrity. But the righteous one will live by his faith. So there are here 4 different traits that we're going to mention that God mentions about the culture. So these are 4 different traits of the culture. The first one is they are morally relative. What that means is their sense of right and wrong depends solely on what they think. It's relative to them. It's your truth for you, that's great, but for me, this is my truth. And they answer to themselves. They decide what's right. This is a very common refrain that you actually hear nowadays. Live your truth. It's a very common thing that you hear. It's I think we can very much so relate to some of the things in Habakkuk. The second thing is they're self-idolatrous, or they worship themselves. They think they're the best. And boy, oh boy, if that doesn't describe our culture, I don't know what does. Everyone is so preoccupied with themselves. Have you been on social media lately? Instagram and TikTok, it's a bunch of people holding cameras about themselves, talking about themselves. All they care about is themselves. Anyways, moving on. And then the third thing that we see here is their discontent. They're never satisfied, never happy. And I think we see a lot of this in our culture too. If I get the dream job, then I'll be happy. If I get a perfect house, then I'll be happy. If I get the perfect partner, then I'll be happy. If we get rid of everyone who doesn't agree with me, then I'll be happy. And I mean, you see this in politics a lot, from both sides, really. We just have to get rid of the other side, and then everything's going to be okay. I guess more could be said there too, huh? If I switch churches, then it's going to solve the problem. It shouldn't change me. I should just change churches. You know, I can't count how many people I talk to who they just go through a bit of a rough situation with the church, and then they go to a new church, and they spend the whole time bad-mouthing the old church. I want to encourage you, real quick. This isn't in my notes. I just want to encourage you. If you go from one church to another church, make sure you leave on good terms. Because if you don't, your heart will go with you, and you will be in a bit of a bad way. If you fix your heart before you go ahead and go if you want to. That's fine. Just fix your heart before you go. If you should feel like God's calling you away from this church, make sure your heart's good. Don't leave on bad terms. Leave on good terms. It's important for your own spiritual growth that you do that. And back to what I was saying. The fourth thing we see in Habakkuk is they're very prideful. They've got no integrity, no sense of honor. They're lovers of self, as the New Testament would describe it. They can't be corrected. The interesting thing about this evil culture and the coming more evil culture that's happening in the book of Habakkuk is that God never once argues the point of their injustice. He never once tells them it's not that bad. He never says that. He actually says the exact opposite. Yeah, it's bad, Habakkuk, and it's going to get worse. Buckle up. And then he goes on to say that they're going to get punished. God will bring justice, but he gives this unfortunate answer eventually. There's going to be justice eventually. And I think it's the waiting that really bothers us the most. You know. So Habakkuk 2:3, this is where he says, for the vision is yet for the appointed time. It testifies about the end and will not lie. Then he says this. It sounds like a contradiction. Listen very closely, because I missed it. And I had to read the book about three or four times before I caught what he said. Though it delays, wait for it. And then here's this part that sounds like a contradiction. Since it will certainly come and not be late. So, though it delays, wait for it. But then he turns around and says, since it will certainly come and not be late. But if it's being delayed, doesn't that mean that it's late? Isn't that by definition what it means? And I always think of this part on The Lord of the Rings where Frodo is sitting with Gandalf and he's talking to him and he says, a wizard is never late, Frodo Baggins. He arrives precisely when he means to. And that's kind of what's happening here is, God's not late. He arrives exactly when he means to. But in our time frame, God is oftentimes late. See, there's going to be a point in time when you say, okay, God has to answer by this point. This is the point of no return. God's got to answer by this point. And then that point comes and goes, God, why didn't you answer? And you figure out, oh, he didn't actually have to answer on my time frame. That was just something that I got myself worked up about. So he's late by our standards, but not by his standards. It's like there's a song that I agree with, but it depends on which perspective. God's never going to let you down. I think we sang it last Sunday, I think. God's never going to let you down. Well, it depends. He's going to let us down in as far as we're going to have our own expectations from God, and he's not going to meet our expectations. So in that sense, yeah, he's going to let you down. But in the sense of his goodness, he is never going to let you down. In the sense of him being in control, he's never going to let you down. It just depends if your eyes are on you or on God. Late to us is not late to God. And this, I think, is one of the biggest things we struggle with in our culture. We get very worked up, and we want an easy, quick fix, right? If we just have a day of prayer, or if we have a period of fasting, or if we have a revival, then it's going to fix everything. But Habakkuk is actually prophesying during a time when they are experiencing revival, and the wickedness becomes all the more prone, and the leaders, the goodness that some of the leaders like King Josiah establish doesn't stay. See, we can't fix our culture with a rant or a Facebook post or whatever else, and we also can't fix it with voting. And the reason why we can't fix it with voting is because men love darkness rather than light. Voting is never going to fix the problem because men love darkness rather than light. And Revelations tells us what's going to happen. Okay, there will be revivals, people will get saved, but things will continue to go downhill, and then Jesus will come back. Revelations tells us that's going to happen. Buckle up. It's okay. It's all right. Don't get upset. Don't get bent out of shape. But God already knew it was going to happen a long time ago. So what about now? These wicked people who are doing wicked things, they're going to get punishment eventually. But what about now? Well, 2:4 says this. Look, his ego is inflated. He is without integrity. But the righteous one will live by his faith. The righteous one will live by his faith. So this is going to be God's answer, and we'll look at this a little bit more. But nowhere in the book does God give an easy or quick solution to the problem of the evil culture around them. And we do live in an evil culture nowadays, too. Very much so. And just like then, there is no quick and easy solution. And in 2:4, you have God basically saying, yes, the wicked, yes, absolutely. But God's people are to live by faith in the midst of their wicked culture. 2 Corinthians 5:7 says something very similar. It says, for we walk by faith, not by sight. We're not living according to the way that we see things. We're living by faith. So what does that mean? What does it mean that the righteous should live by faith? Well, I think that a real simple way that we could say this is simply, we take it to God. Living by faith is taking it to God. I think that that's the simplest way you can say this. But I think that some examples might help, because sometimes simplicity doesn't really get the point across. So I think there are 3 different things we can kind of, sentences that will get this point across that Habakkuk is getting at. Living by faith is, first off, waiting for salvation. It's waiting for salvation. I'm in this situation. I'm waiting for God to move. I don't know how long I'm waiting for, but I'm waiting. That's exactly what we saw from chapter 2, verse 3. Let's see if I put it in again. I did not put it in again, so I had to go scroll back to it. Like a fool. It's here eventually. Come on, Michael. There it is. For the vision is yet for the appointed time. It testifies about the end and will not lie. Though it delays, wait for it, since it will certainly come and not be late. So we're waiting. But this is the thing about waiting. This is what we do. We wait, and okay, I waited. We're actually reading a children's book about it by Mo Williams. It's about this pig and this elephant. And, I'm not going to bore you with the elaborate details of this children's book because there are no elaborate details. But the pig goes to the elephant and he says, hey, I've got you this gift. And the elephant says, okay, great, give it to me. He says, you got to wait for it. And he says, okay, I'll wait. Can I have it now? I'm done waiting. I waited. Now, can you give it to me? And this is exactly what we do with God. Like, okay, we waited. Now it's time for you to, there was an unspoken rule here, God. I kept my mouth shut for a day or two. Now you need to fix it. And that's not really how God does things. Waiting is after some time of waiting, you're still waiting. And that's a little bit difficult. I'm not great at this. I prefer things done yesterday. And that's not really how God was responding to Habakkuk, and it's not really how God responds to us today. Though it delays, wait for it. Because oftentimes God answering does seem very delayed. So here, we can go on to another example. Something bothers you, okay? Let's say, for instance, you're watching the news and something you see there bothers you. It can be anything, and you know this is true. There's always bad news on the news. It can be anything from some conflict, either globally or locally, to some immorality that you see on the news, and it just really gets you bent out of shape. It gets you upset. It could be maybe it could be a chronic health issue that you struggle with. I know there's a lot of us who have that. A lot of us have issues that we take medicine for, and we have to deal with the side effects of the medicine, which is all the funner. Maybe it's a sin that you just can't break free from, and you're getting frustrated. God, I've prayed, I've depended on you, I've waited, I'm just not seeing your freedom come in this. Can't you just free me of it? Why can't you just take it away? And we pray and we pray and we pray and don't seem to get an answer. Maybe it's your finances. Maybe you are just in a lot of debt and you're just having a rough time there. Whatever it is, I know as for me, I think I worry a lot about things that maybe are rational, maybe are not. I'm not sure. But they come to me in my dreams and keep me from going to sleep. And so a good example of that is one stupid thing that I worry about that I probably shouldn't, because it doesn't do any good worrying about it. But I worry about, in case of a war, will I still be able to get my medicine? Because that would be terrible and terrifying to go through the withdrawals and all those different things without the medicine while there's a global pandemic, or conflict, and that just kind of terrifies me in and of itself. So whatever it is, something is bothering you. It could be anything, and you know yourself more than I do. But either way, living by faith in that context would be responding in faith. Living in faith is responding in faith. Which kind of sounds like I'm talking in circles, so I'll kind of break it down. It's where you choose to trust God with this moment that you're in right now in light of the darkness. It's not, I'm waiting and I believe that things are going to get better. And I'm waiting for things to get better so that way I can rejoice again. Well, God actually wants to build you up here in the midst of your darkness where you can worship Him then. If you've ever dealt with depression, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You want the depression to go away. You don't want to feel like this, but you just feel like giving up. Nothing you seems to work. You try all the different things. Everybody has a different solution for you. Oh, this is how you get out of depression. This is how you get out of depression. They all are going to tell you their little magical cures, and they don't work for you, so you get upset. And you think, it must just be me. Maybe God doesn't love me enough to answer me. Maybe I just did something so bad that God just doesn't even hear my prayers anymore. And you get into these kinds of situations, and it's very easy to say, if God would just fix this, then I'd worship you, God. Then I'd give you my life. Then I'd rejoice, and I'd be set free. And that's just not really how God does things a lot of times. Sometimes you have to carry things like depression even for a lifetime, and learn to praise God in the darkness. And I want to encourage you though. It's that form of broken worship isn't less worthy to God. It's actually more substantial when you lift up a song to God when you just don't feel like it. You're just not there. So it's trusting in God with this moment of darkness. Responding in faith, though, I think maybe I could clarify that a little bit better. What really is responding to a situation in faith? Well, I'm going to give you a little formula, but first off, there was a time when I was having really bad anxiety, like crazy bad anxiety. We found out after the fact that part of it was actually due to my disease. It causes intense feelings of anxiety. So because it was untreated, the anxiety was a lot worse. And obviously, I don't think that was the entire situation, but it was obviously a good chunk of it. And so when I was going through the worst of my anxiety, I remember thinking quite a lot, what if this happens? What if this happens? I can't go here because what if this happens? I can't go on a road trip because what if this happens? And your mind just kind of goes crazy. It's kind of like Maria, moving around a lot in your head, always moving. And you're trying to just sit down and relax, but your brain's just not having it. It's just going a million miles an hour. If you've ever dealt with anxiety, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And, what if this, what if this? But responding in faith, I think, could be kind of compared to this. Responding in faith says, even if. Even if. Faith is not, I think sometimes faith gets a bad rap. Faith is not, well, I just reject that from happening. Right? Because what if it does happen? Right? Like, oh, I have strong enough faith, so that's not going to happen. Well, but what if it does happen, though? Like, that you can't make something not happen simply by rejecting it. You know what I mean? Like, oh, I have cancer, but I reject it. No, you still have cancer, though. Like, it's still there. Rejecting it and pretending that it's not there isn't going to fix the problem, right? And I think sometimes we kind of give faith a bad rap, and we try to make it where you have to have enough faith in your faith for it to be true faith. But faith isn't something that you conjure up in yourself and you work yourself up into. Even if it is that bad, even if I do struggle with this sin forever and God never gives me victory over it, even if I'm never healed, even if I am financially ruined and I will never recover from this, even if I am still going to praise God, I'm still going to seek Him, and I'm still going to trust Him. That is faith. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. Faith can move mountains, but if God's placed the mountain there in the first place, He decides when it goes. And that's just the way you got to be okay with it. You got to be okay with not being in control. And sometimes we deal with faith as though we're in control of the situation. I have strong enough faith and I'll fix this. Sometimes you can't fix it. Faith isn't about the situation being fixed. It's about trusting God with the situation. And faith is also not declaring something. I'm going to be healed and I'm just declaring it. Well, if God promised you, you can declare it, but you can't just pick and choose what God has to answer. He's going to answer this. I tell you, you don't know how many times I've talked to people who are real bitter at God because they prayed for their grandma to get healed and she didn't, and she died. Older people die. Sometimes younger people die. My mom was only 63 years old. She wasn't old. We all had faith. We all believed. We all prayed. Do you honestly think that she died because we didn't have enough faith? No, it was her time to go. Not every time that somebody dies is it because of a lack of faith. Have people died because of a lack of faith? Yes. Yes, I'm sure that has happened. But it's important to remember that there's this really good story in the Gospels where Jesus is teaching people in this house, and there's these people who bring a paralyzed friend to Jesus to be healed, but they can't get in. So they take him to the roof, and they cut a hole in the roof, and they lower him down. And he was actually healed because of his friend's faith, not his faith. So just some interesting things there. So faith is not any of that. Faith is also not some rainbow fairyland where bad things don't happen. Faith does not mean that bad things will not happen to you. That's not what faith means. And definitely, and I will say this, there is a certain lunacy to faith. And I'm not just talking about the lunacy where it seems like foolishness to the world, but I mean faith in and of itself has a certain sense of lunacy to it, where it oftentimes doesn't make sense. And you have to reach a point of you can't get answers, you can't justify it, and yet you're still believing. You know what I mean? We have reason for our faith. It's not a blind faith. Our faith is not an irrational, illogical thing. But there's this point in situations where we come up against a wall and we really get to a place of the lunacy of faith, where we have to choose to lean into God when we don't have a reason to. Well, God's let me down before. God won't answer me in this before. I've prayed for this for years and He still hasn't answered me. But still leaning into faith. And at the time, it seems like lunacy because God, why you won't answer me? You won't give me. You won't fix this. You won't even tell me why you went through this. Why didn't you just give me a heads up that this was going to happen? Have you ever been there where you're wondering, God, you know everything. Why couldn't you just said, hey, this is not going to go how you want? Doesn't the Bible say that surely God doesn't do anything without telling his prophets first? Surely God could have told somebody, and somebody could have told me or something. But faith oftentimes doesn't have that perfect answer. And so we take these questions to God, and we're really shook up, and we want these perfect answers. And sometimes God doesn't really give an answer. And that's exactly what we see in Habakkuk. He doesn't really give him an answer. He just says the righteous will live by faith. Well, I was kind of wanting a Wikipedia article on what's going on and with sources and, kind of get real in depth here. And that's just not really how God plays ball. God, don't you see this thing could happen? But faith says even if it does, the righteous will live by faith. So what does that really mean? It means this, at least in part, that the righteous are those who live by faith in trying times. You might say, I'm not righteous. I know me. I mess up a lot. I'm just not there. And I think that's there's two natural in our flesh responses to God. The first is I don't need God. I'm doing fine. And the second is I'm too low for God to take notice of me. And neither of these views are correct. But in this case, I think sometimes the more dominant one in this case is, I'm obviously not one of the righteous. I'm one of the screw-ups. But the righteous are those who live by faith in trying times. It's not those who are perfect. It's not those who think that they're perfect. And we definitely are in trying times today. I don't think that's news to anybody. You get outside, right? We are definitely in trying times. And it doesn't look like it's going to let up anytime soon. So like Habakkuk, though, we often have to walk through it. God oftentimes won't take it away. Sometimes he does. I've seen sometimes people get saved and they don't do drugs anymore. I've seen that happen. Absolutely. But I've also seen it happen way more times than that, where God doesn't take away and they have to keep fighting their addiction for year upon year upon year. I've seen some people go to the grave trusting in God that he's going to set them free and never sing it. Is their faith any less because they didn't see victory on earth? See, in our thinking, yes, their faith wasn't strong enough, because if they had strong enough faith in God, their addiction would have been gone. Well, that's not really what the Bible teaches, though. That's not really what the Bible teaches at all. Sometimes even when you pray, God still won't take it away. And it's this painful, painful thing that we have to get to the point of realizing that we're not God. That God doesn't answer to us, and just because we ask for it doesn't mean that God has to give it to us. Because we aren't God. Painful, painful times. I think this is one of the most painful lessons that kids can learn. When you go to school, high school, and there's all the things that other people have that you don't, and you just want to be someone else. You remember what it was like in high school? I'd never go back to being a kid ever again. Never, ever, ever. You girls know what I'm talking about. Oh, I wish I had her physical attribute that you don't think that you have, or whatever. And the guys, oh, I wish I had his fame. I wish I had his girlfriend. And you go through all these things of, all this, but you don't. You don't have that. And you can get upset about it. You can try to pretend you're something that you're not, but it doesn't fix the problem. Isaiah 43:2 says this: when you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and the rivers will not overwhelm you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be scorched, and the flame will not burn you. I'll read it again because I didn't put emphasis on the part I wanted you to pay attention to. When you pass through the waters, you're going to pass through the waters. I will be with you, and the rivers will not overwhelm you. Now, this doesn't mean that you will not feel overwhelmed. This does not mean that you will not feel overwhelmed. Okay? It doesn't mean that it won't kill you. That's not what it means at all. It means that God's going to carry you through it. And even if it does kill you, he's going to carry you the whole way. It's going to be okay. When you walk through the fire, you will not be scorched and the flame will not burn you. When you walk through. When. The situation is definitely a chance to grow your faith. And I think we all get to a point of saying, I want to be closer to God. Right? Don't we all want to be closer to God? Well, this is how. by walking through the water and the fire. That's how you get closer to God. Habakkuk 3:17, this is part of his song at the end of the book. It says, though the fig tree does not bud, and there is no fruit on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food. Well, this sounds hopeful. Though the flocks disappear from the pen and there are no herds in the stalls, yet I will celebrate in the Lord. And there is the faith. It's not going the way that I always want it to. But yet I will celebrate in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord, my Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like those of a deer and enables me to walk on mountain heights. So we want God to grow our faith. I think we all want that. But without having the experience that tries our faith. Faith is grown by it being tried. We want God to grow us, but then we want to live in a culture with no problems. God, fix the culture. I want to grow, but fix my culture. Well, what if, and roll with me on this, what if God places us very strategically in an evil culture so as to test our commitment and to grow our faith? This isn't a foreign idea to the Bible. You remember back to the very first story of the Bible. Well, the second story. The first one was God creating things. The second story of the Bible, where Adam and Eve were in the garden. Did you ever think it's kind of funny that God chose of all places there to put the tree? They were living in the Garden of Eden. He could have put it anywhere on the entire globe, but he put it right there in the garden with them, right? From the get-go, God has always given us opportunities to grow our faith. Sometimes we look back and say, but I wish we had it back how they had it. That's just being discontent with the situation you're in. It doesn't matter where you are, what situation you're in, God can grow your faith through it. When I first got the diagnosis, I remember thinking, couldn't you give me something else? Something that I could have praised you through. Something that there could have been a solution for, and I could have gone and said, look, I got victory over this. Instead, he gave me something I had to carry through the rest of my life. Boy, that's real fun. I still have this friend who's wheelchair bound, and not once but 2 different times he's had people telling him that he needed to have more faith, and moved in a sense of hopefulness, I guess. They took him and they threw him out of his wheelchair, hoping that their faith would be enough to bring his legs back into action, I guess. And his face hurts a little, but he's okay. Did not work for him. And I'm obviously not saying that God doesn't heal. I think that's definitely the wrong message I'm trying to get across. But God doesn't do things in the way that we want him to. And we're wanting God. A good example of this is how we look at our culture. We want the culture to just be fixed. No problems. No more. We don't want to have any more bad politicians. No more bad things happening. We want to wake up, get a cup of coffee, and we turn on the news and they say there's world peace. Everybody's leaving Jerusalem alone finally. They went to their own backyard and left them alone. And then, the president decided, hey, no more taxes. Taxes are theft. So we're going to go ahead and stop taking taxes. We're just going to give it back to you guys because it's yours anyway. And we're going to be fine on that. You just live your life however you see fit, and we're just going to back off like we probably should have in the first place. But, whatever. Whatever. So the third thing, living by faith, is taking fear and doubt to God. There's this misconception about faith, and I've mentioned it already once, and let's mention it again, that faith is not having any doubt. If you have strong enough faith, you will never struggle in your walk with God. Well, that's just not true. Many people in the Bible struggled with their faith. Many people. To list just a few, how about Job? He spends an entire book struggling with his faith. How about Jonah, who was struggling with his faith so bad he decided to fool you with it? I'm hopping ship. I'm getting out of Dodge. There's got to be somewhere else out there. Or how about Habakkuk, the book that we're reading, where he takes his complaint to God and God says, yeah, you're right, and it's going to get worse. And he says, what? How could you possibly let that happen? And God says, now let me tell you how bad it's actually going to get. Oh, and by the way, the righteous is going to live by faith. God, that's not exactly the answer I was hoping for. So what separated these people of faith that struggled with their faith from people who are condemned for having doubt? Well, a very important thing. They took their doubt to God. You see this happen with David, King David, over and over again. Struggling, taking it to God. Struggling, taking it to God. Habakkuk was very much so confused. Why, God? Why are you letting this happen? He was irritated. These people, they're ripping people off, and nobody's doing anything about it. The judges are corrupt. The leaders are corrupt. Nothing's happening. And then he was obviously afraid, too, of the situation. And then God told him how bad it was going to get, and he got even more afraid. The people Habakkuk complained about really were as bad as he was complaining. Now, most of the time that you're going to complain about people in your life, they're not going to be as bad as you think that they are. Somebody's going to talk about them, and you're going to think that it's true when it's just gossip, which takes things out of context. And you're going to come up in your head, and you're going to let your thoughts run wild. And the end version of this person is going to be Satan incarnate, right? Everything, and it's easier to do that. It's easier to do that. We take the greatest villains of history. The worst people of history had some good to them, but we only remember the very evil so that we can put ourselves in a false chart. Good people, bad people. I'm up here, Hitler's down here. My wife, well, maybe not. But, I'm up here, so it kind of pulls her up. And, the people at work, they're down here with Hitler. Whoever is here's my chart, here's the bad people. And it's easier that way, but it's not, once again, not quite so accurate. But Habakkuk did very much so choose faith in the midst of fear and doubt. Habakkuk chose faith in the midst of fear and doubt. Well, let me say this. This is the last couple things I want to say. God's answer was not everything working out. Usually our prayers revolve around everything working out. God's answer was also not Habakkuk's wildest dreams coming true. Same is true for us today. We live in an evil culture. We want our wildest dreams to come true. We want everything fixed overnight. God's answer to Habakkuk was also not his every prayer getting answered. Sometimes we mistake this. I will be happy if God just answers my every prayer. Then I'll be happy. No, you won't. And it'll stagnate your faith. God has to bring us to some very low valleys to show us just how high the mountain is. Because the mountaintop is good for looking, but the valley is good for growing. And God didn't call us to live on the mountaintop. So God's answer actually was the righteous will live by faith. Here's all the bad things that are going on. The righteous are going to live by faith. God's answer hasn't changed. How do we deal with sinners then? With humility. How do we deal with our sin without excuse? How do we deal with ministry? By controlling our mouths. How do we deal with our culture? By living by faith. By living by faith.